What we're going to talk about today is .NET Extensibility in Azure Logic Apps. My name is Kent Weir. I'm a principal PM manager on the team, and excited to share some of our existing capabilities, but also have a few announcements / teasers to share with you all as well. So let's get right into it. So I'll just spend a couple minutes just talking about Azure Logic Apps, just in case some people may not be familiar with it. But Azure Logic Apps is a low-code, cloud-based workflow tool for automating workflows and integrating your business processes across hybrid environments in a very visual manner. And so typically our programming model looks like this. We have events, things that happen that prompt a workflow to be initiated. And then within that workflow, we've got a series of actions that allow you to perform a set of instructions. And you can really think of this as a visual workflow like that can coordinate many different activities across different systems. And naturally, as you interact with these different systems, there's output data that you can subsequently use downstream in further actions. So let's just take a quick look at a visual that might help describe this. So this is a workflow, and what we have is a series of building blocks, and these building blocks are largely related to connectors, and then some internal built-in actions as well. So at the top, we have a trigger, and in this case, this is going to be a service bus trigger that is going to listen for messages that arrive inside of a particular queue. When that message arrives, then it'll go ahead and fire up this workflow and then do subsequent processing. So there's a few different modes in which these workflows can be initiated. This is more of an event-based approach, but we also have a schedule. So every 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, go perform a set of steps. We can go ahead and do that as well. And then there's also manual. If it's say an HTTP request, that is another sort of popular way to invoke a particular workflow. We then have what we would call these flow control actions. So these are sort of your typical constructs that you would see inside of your coding environment. So things like looping, if then else, switch statements. In this case, we've got some parallelism going on, and we also have some scopes. So, if you're familiar with your try-catch semantics in your favorite programming language, you can kind of think of it much like that. Beyond that, we also have support for VNets and private endpoint support. So if you need to go ahead and call on premises services, you can go ahead and do so securely over a VNet. And then we also have two modes in which these workflows will run. One is in a stateful mode, which is a durable, reliable mechanism where we checkpoint after each of these actions. And then there's also stateless. So if you want to squeeze out a little bit more performance, better in some low latency scenarios, perhaps request response, where you might have a user waiting on that execution, that might be a good opportunity to go ahead and use stateless. And then last but not least, we do have a full audit log inside of a run history. And really that is just a replay. It basically shows you step by step exactly what took place as part of your workflow orchestration. All right, so that's with that out of the way. Let's get more into the core topic here. So low code is great, and we're proud of our low code nature here. Our driver is really how we can democratize building out these workflows and how dev teams can scale by bringing more people to the proverbial party so that you can go ahead and do more. But naturally, there's some situations where you do need a little bit more control or a little bit more power. And that's really where this whole extensibility story begins, because you can now complement your low code efforts with code, in this case, .NET. So, and I'll get into a live demo here shortly, but just a little bit of background here. So in October of last year, we did GA our custom code extensibility for .NET Framework. And you might be asking, okay, well, why .NET Framework? And really the initial driver was we have customers that are using an on-premises middleware tool called BizTalk Server, and that is all built based upon .NET Framework. And certainly for those customers that have built some extensibility in BizTalk, we want to help those customers move to Azure Logic Apps. And so we built this feature that allows them to bring some of those custom code investments along for the ride inside of Azure Logic Apps. Now, what we did to achieve this is we introduced a new Logic Apps workspace project type, and you can see that represented here at the top. That is a workspace, and we have a tour, and you'll see that when we go into the demo. But we create two projects, one for functions and one for Logic Apps. And so this function project is actually an Azure function project that you can go ahead and write code inside of this VS Code experience, and then be able to go ahead and compile this code, and we will bin place it inside of the Azure Logic app itself. When the assembly is generated, this built-in action will allow you to select the code that you've previously authored, and then be able to go ahead and call it right inside of your Logic app workflow. So once again, it's a little bit of best of both worlds. Take advantage of low code drag and drop, and then tap into your custom code when needed, and then be able to jump back into the workflow and use any of those outputs from the code call in downstream actions. Now, certainly one piece of feedback we did get from customers, okay, this is really cool, this is great, but if I'm not a BizTalk customer, can I get this in a newer .NET version? And the good news is we have been working hard on .NET 8 support. I was hoping to be able to show it today. We just ran into a small issue, but do look for that shortly. The experience is going to be exactly what I show you today. The difference will be that it's actually .NET 8 under the hood, but that is just something to be aware of. Now, in terms of when would I want to use custom code in Azure Logic Apps? So here's a few reasons that I can think of, and certainly talking with customers, these tend to rise to the top. The first is business logic. You might have some complex business logic that doesn't lend itself very well to that visual editor, where you might have a whole series of if then else, if then else, if then else, switch statements, calculations, etc. It might be just better suited for being able to write in code, be able to then go write tests against that code, have it a little bit more testable, and that's a perfectly valid use for custom code. We do have a data mapper, which does allow you to transform dot messages, say like a JSON message into an XML message, or vice versa. But sometimes people like to write that inside of custom code. Once again, there might be some testability needs that they're going after, or they just feel more comfortable writing that in managed code versus using XSLT 3. And so sometimes people will use an Azure function for this separately, and now you can include this in your workflow project itself and have that code sitting closer to your logic. We've seen situations, even though our traffic is all encrypted when we think about TLS and things of that nature, but sometimes people want more message level encryption. Maybe there's some third-party libraries that they use, like Bouncy Castle or PGP, and they want to do more message level encryption as well. And that's an opportunity where you could go ahead and use this custom code experience. We do allow you to include compiled DLLs like that you reference, or NuGet packages, and so you can take advantage of some of those libraries that might exist. On a similar vein, encoding and decoding is also an opportunity that people will use this capability for. Now, the next piece is a little bit interesting in the sense that we do offer a custom connector experience, and you can use this in a similar manner. So I'm not calling it a full-fledged custom connector just to avoid any confusion, but you can go ahead if you had some maybe REST calls that you wanted to go ahead and build that out, or maybe you needed to do some sort of protocol connectivity with some message queuing broker or something along those lines. You could go ahead and write that code and then expose it through an action like I showed you on the previous slide, and use it kind of like a connector. So that is an option and something that you could potentially explore. And then last but certainly not least, reusability. So that notion of hey, we've got common libraries that do certain things, and whenever we're building a Logic Apps project, we can go ahead and include those components and then make sure that they're being reused across our dev teams. So those would be some of the reasons that you could go ahead and do this. So let's get out of the slides. And what I'm going to do is take you through kind of a hello world experience with respect to VS Code and a demo. So let's just open up a VS Code. Now, I guess for folks that may not be as familiar, we do have an extension. It's called Logic Apps Standard. And this is going to unlock a lot of this capability for you. We do have some other prerequisites, but when you install this for the first time and you run it, you're going to see a prompt in the bottom right-hand corner that's going to ask you for permission to go get all of these dependencies, and we will take care of all of that for you. And it should be a pretty harmless experience. Take a few minutes and you'll have your development environment all set up. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to the Azure A here. And once you've got that extension installed, you can go ahead and click on this Create New Logic App Workspace. And when you do that, what we're going to do is run you through a little bit of a wizard. And that wizard is going to make things quite simple to get this sorted out, to get this set up. So I'm going to create a folder here. So let's just call this Net Day. And we'll select that particular folder. And now this is that wizard that I was talking about. So I'm going to be asked for a workspace name, and this can be whatever you choose to call it. So I'm just going to call this Net Day Workspace. Then I've got two options here. I've got Logic App with Custom Code Project, or just the Logic App without the code. Now, in this case, I'm going to select the Custom Code Project. When we get into this .NET 8 world, what you're then going to subsequently see is two options. You're going to see .NET Framework 4.7.2 or .NET 8, and really you'll have the opportunity to choose whichever one makes sense for you. Now, the sample that we do provide, just as a kind of some boilerplate code, is just related to weather. So I'm going to call this function getWeather. I'm going to be asked for a namespace, and I'm just going to go ahead and choose Contoso. And then as part of this onboarding experience, we also create a workflow with you, a sample workflow. In this case, I'm going to choose a stateful workflow, and I'm being prompted for a name, so I'm just going to call it My Workflow. And we'll open it in the current window. All right, so let's just take a brief tour here. This is the workflow, but let's close this for now. We have that workspace file that I talked about. We have the functions project, and let's go ahead and just open up the sample file that or method that we create for you. So what you'll see here is, this is an Azure function. We do have the function name decoration here. We do have a specific a trigger that we actually wrote and that we include as part of this a NuGet package, and it's called Workflow Action Trigger. And this is what allows this code to basically respond to that custom or to that code action that we saw in the workflow itself. So this is something that the Logic Apps team has done specific to unlock this particular scenario. Now, the other thing to be aware of, we do support a variety of different inputs and outputs. These are just samples, right? So I've got an integer of a zip code coming in. I've got a temperature scale coming in, is this going to be Celsius or Fahrenheit? But I can also take in complex objects as well. So I'm going to, in this case, return a complex object of weather. It's nothing too complicated, but it is a complex object. And then here I've just got essentially some random code that's written here just to show some variability in terms of what we're trying to do. So this is what we would go ahead and execute. And what we will also do to simplify the ability to call this code is we do include some build tasks. And so you'll see in this csproj file, we've got some specific build tasks that will take our compiled output and then go ahead and deposit them or bin place them into a folder in the Logic App project. So we wanted to keep the Logic App project very much intact to its current structure. And this idea that you've got this function project that you'll compile it, and then we'll bin place those files in the right folder in the Logic Apps project itself. Then I think probably what we can do now is let's go ahead and just compile this code, and then I'll be able to launch that workflow for you. So we'll just go ahead and do a .NET restore. And then a .NET build. And then what we should see is this folder being updated here quite shortly. Okay, so that build took place. We'll now see a custom folder that exists. Now there's kind of two pieces here that are quite important. We will create this function.json. This is essentially like metadata that describes the function that we just authored. So it's going to have all of our inputs and outputs. And this will be quite useful when we get into the workflow and we're getting asked to go ahead and provide inputs and what is the expected shape of the output that code's going to return. So this is an important file. And then the other thing is we've got the actual assembly and all of its related dependencies as well. So what we can now do is we can go ahead and open up this workflow in the workflow designer. And we see just this sample workflow that we can go ahead and get started with. Now, when we click on this particular action, we've got this dropdown. And this dropdown is really being populated from that function.json file. So we could certainly have more than one function inside of this project. And provided you've wired it up all correctly, when you compile that code, basically you'll see all of those different functions enumerated in this dropdown. So that becomes quite useful from that perspective. Now, the other thing to note is that it's automatically gone ahead and inspected and that metadata and has drawn these specific inputs that we need to go ahead and provide. Now, these are hard-coded currently, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we could naturally get them from the trigger, but we could also, if we wanted to just have a compose action, we can go ahead and just create kind of like a variable in this case. So we'll just call this zip code. And here we'll just go ahead and hard code a value here. But just to show you how this dynamic content works, we can now go in, click on this lightning bolt, and then go ahead and select our output. And that will naturally be passed as an input. Now, when it comes to going ahead and responding back to the original caller, at this point, it's taking all of the output from that local function, but that's just going to give us too much information. We can go ahead and provide a better experience here, and we can just construct a JSON message here. So we could just say current weather. And now we can go ahead and use the outputs that came from our code. So here we've got different properties that were part of that output. So we could go ahead and just say current weather from that perspective. So now we've gone ahead and we've saved our workflow, and we can go ahead and use our debugger in this case. So let's go ahead, let's set a breakpoint. Doesn't really matter where. That's in our code. We can go ahead and set a breakpoint inside of our workflow itself. And now what we can go ahead and do is just start the debugger. So we're going to go ahead and attach to the Logic app first. And this will take a few seconds to get wired up. And then what we can go ahead and do is attach to the .NET debugger as well. All right, we're good to go. We can see we've got that URL, and we can also see that our workflow action trigger has also been loaded up. So now let's go ahead, connect to our code, and that is wired up. We can launch this by heading over to our workflow, clicking on Overview. And here, basically, we've got like a little bit of a management experience going on. So here's the endpoint URL. If we wanted to call this from Postman, we could, but we can also just go ahead and click on this Run Trigger. And now we're in our debug experience. So we can step through this line by line by hitting F10, and naturally we can hit F5 to complete the execution. And if we head back over here, we can see that it was successful. Now, I talked about that audit trail before, and this is an example of that. We can see exactly the inputs that were passed in, and then we can see the outputs that were also returned as well. So that is the sort of first demo. Now I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit just to talk about our portal experience. So once you've gone ahead and deployed this to Azure, then it's one of those things where, okay, now what would this look like inside of Azure once it's been deployed? So let's just head over. This is a different project that I've previously deployed. And if we go into this artifacts folder and then we've got assemblies, we're going to see basically the DLL and its prerequisites already here. So it's called get weather as well. And then we've got those existing, let's close this out. We've got those existing prerequisite DLLs that it would have brought along for the ride. If we go ahead and look into our designer, we also are going to see a similar experience to what we saw inside of VS Code. Now, the difference here is that you're not going to be able to author the code. You could go ahead and configure the code. Like if there was multiple functions, you could go ahead and select a different one. You can change the way the inputs and outputs are used, but naturally authoring that code is going to be inside of VS Code at this point. But I do have something coming just related to the being in the portal and being able to do some .NET. All right, now another piece just to talk a little bit about is just logging and sort of how can I take advantage of logging. Now, when I'm in the local VS Code environment, we did have some of those log statements that you may have noticed here, right? So we do instantiate a logging factory, and then we can go ahead and use the logger to log information, warnings, errors, etc. And so that's something that you do have control over. And when you're in terminal, you can actually see this data being captured. So in this case, we did pass in 85396 and Celsius, and that was logged, and we have access to that naturally as well. Okay, let's see. So there's another sort of piece to talk about here, and that is just the relationship with application insights. And I don't have a full demo here, but just wanted to call this out because it is quite important as well. So obviously inside of your code, you can go ahead and have your exception handling in place. And when an exception does occur, and provided you've got application insights enabled for your Logic app, this information will be passed over to application insights and will land inside of the exceptions table. So you'll be able to get some additional verbose messaging here by looking at the exception that is captured inside of that table. Now here, I was trying to make this fail, so I just threw a new exception. You could see that it would happen on line 32, and that actually is captured here. And this is my exception, was the custom message that I had provided as part of that. So that's something that does come up from time to time, is how do I sort of see what's going on with my custom code once it's deployed, and this would be certainly one of the ways that you can go ahead and do that. All right, so now just to talk a little bit about something else that we do have in flight as well. So previously we've talked more about managed code, and it has been designed for more advanced customer scenarios, and it is dependent upon VS Code, as I mentioned, for that authoring experience. Now, we still have a large user population that does use the workflow designer inside of the Azure portal. And technically, this would work in VS Code in that designer as well. But predominantly, we see this being used inside of Azure portal. And so this would be the opportunity to go ahead and do some scripting. Like in my opinion, this is one of those things where you need to write a few lines of code to do some parsing or some transformation. This is a good opportunity where you don't have to sort of worry about some of those other dependencies of using VS Code. But if you're writing more than 20 lines of code, you should probably be in VS Code and do it using those particular tools. So we are introducing, and once again, this is will be out pretty soon as well, like definitely this spring, where we will include scripting support for C#, and then also scripting support for PowerShell as well. And so these would show up inside of a connector-like experience. So you would add this connector, and then you'd have a small window that you could go ahead and write some code. The code that you do write gets stored in a separate file if it's a PowerShell file or if it's a C# file. And that gets stored inside of your folder, inside of your project. So that's something that you can then put into source control, and sort of manage it from that perspective. We will also support dynamic content support. So, for example, if you had inputs from your trigger and you wanted to use them inside of your C# code or your PowerShell script, you have the opportunity to do that. And same thing downstream, like if you have a response and you want to use the response from your C# script, you also have those abilities as well. And certainly, especially in the case of PowerShell, there's going to be some existing libraries that you may want to go ahead and leverage. And so we will allow you to go ahead and do that, similar to what I showed you previously in that assemblies experience inside of the Azure portal. The ability to go ahead and upload those so that you can then go ahead and reference them is something that we will also support as well. All right, so I did want to leave you with a few different, links that will help you stay up to date with Azure Logic Apps. The first one is our Azure Integration Services blog, and this is aka.ms/Azure Integration blog. All of our major product announcements are made here. So if you want to keep up to date, this is your best place to go ahead and to do so. Now, naturally, that can be a little bit busy at times. So what we do every month, on the first Monday of the month, we go ahead and put out a newsletter also on the blog. And we do call this the Logic Apps Aviators newsletter. Aviators is the name of our community. And this is where we will summarize all of the product announcements. And also, we will go ahead and highlight our community members as well. So each month, we do have our ACE Aviator, who's someone that we recognize for doing some great work inside of the community. And then we also have a community section where we go ahead and highlight blog posts that we do discover, each month as we're sort of scouring social media. And the best way to be discovered is that hashtag Logic Apps Aviators hashtag is the best way to get noticed. And then the other thing that we do is Logic Apps Live. This is part of the Azure Developers Community Stand-Up Series. And this takes place on the 4th Thursday of every month at 11 a.m. Pacific. It's hosted live on YouTube and Twitch, and it is available on demand after the event. So we just had ours last Thursday. So go ahead and check that out. You can find it at aka.ms/LA Live. And during these sessions, we also dedicate a good chunk, probably 15, 20 minutes for live Q&A. So that's another opportunity for you to get in touch with the product group and provide some feedback. So with that, that's what I had planned today for my session.